All right, so good morning, YouTube. In today's video, we're going to be continuing the Simplify Your Training series. So I'm really appreciative for your guys' support. And in today's video, we're going to be covering the topic of training intensity. So let's get into it. All right, so training intensity. Intensity kind of has two meanings, and this is kind of regardless of whether you train more so for strength or more so for size. Doesn't really matter. You need to understand that intensity, generally speaking, and in most conversations, it's going to mean weight relative to your 1 rep max. But we can't ignore the fact that intensity should also take into consideration your proximity to failure. So this is a very useful chart that you can use, kind of gives you an idea of like percentages, RPE, and the number of reps you can perform. And it gives you a good way to kind of pick and choose some starting points as far as your program goes. So one thing I also want to point out is that when it comes to strength training, you're going to cycle between harder and easier training sessions to allow progression to occur. So you're going to start, I hope you guys can see this, but you're going to start somewhere here and then like build up and move forward so that way it like ends up here. That's kind of the basics of linear periodization, because if you look at any graph of linear periodization, you're going to start out with higher volumes, lower overall intensity. So that's around here because this is 12 reps at this amount of percentage. And then as the intensity climbs and increases, where you finally have yourself a new PR, a new single, or whatever you want for strength, then volume has to drop to compensate. Now, when it comes to hypertrophy, that is not by any means necessary, and it might even be counterproductive to you. What might be more beneficial to you, and what I think is probably more beneficial to you, is keeping your tonnage, keeping your volume more stable across time, and adding weight when necessary. So weight jumps are going to be less frequent and more far between, but they are going to be always motivated or justified by a certain level of performance in your volume work. And we're going to discuss that in this video. So intensity, volume, and frequency are three sides of a pyramid, or three sliders that all affect one another. So I don't know if any of you guys have played a Dark Souls game or a FromSoft game and where there is a character builder. And if you notice how in some character builders, if you manipulate one variable, other variables have to compensate and or are forced to adjust because of the manipulation of that variable. That's the relationship these three have. So these variables feed into one another and affect one another. If volume is high, intensity must be lowered. If intensity is high, volume must be lowered. That's just the way it goes, right? When it comes to frequency, frequency is a very tricky but very, very useful tool. Frequency, by its very nature, exposes you to more intensity and more volume. So when it comes to using it, you have to be very, very careful. It cannot be used long term. And when I say long term, I mean longer than 6 months. I think we kind of have like training ADHD. I think it's a phase of life that everyone who's into the gym, everyone who's into YouTube fitness content kind of goes through YouTube ADHD, because when it comes to learning the skill, the craft, the art, the whatever of fitness from YouTube, we like to think that every single channel we listen to is a different class and all that, which is good. But the way I would think about it instead is like more so like how philosophy was back in the day, where people would just kind of have a forum, discuss things. We're all learning. We're all trying to help one another and try to be involved in that. Don't just try to be a sponge. Try to create for yourself and then try to see how it affects other people as well. So there's that. When it comes to frequency, right? If you increase your training frequency, you are likely going to increase the amount of volume you can recover from and the quality of that volume, meaning the intensiveness of that volume. So if you aren't doing 20 sets of leg work in one day and you instead do 10 and 10, you might be able to squeeze out maybe an extra set. So let's say a more appropriate example might be, let's say you are doing 16 or 15 total sets in one day. Now you add a second day, and instead of doing 8 and 8 or something like that, maybe you can now handle that 10 and 10. And then because of that, because you're more recovered, because of the time in between training sessions, like if you keep them like maybe 3 days apart, then you'll be able to handle more intense work more frequently. But that is not a long-term solution. It can't be done all the time, because eventually the you're going to get to a point where the strength that you have will cause you to need more recovery time. And that's why when it comes to specialization phases, that's why they're a thing, because you need to have times where you can just be recovered and then so that you can have another specialization phase. It's kind of like cutting. You cut to make room for a bulk. Same thing happens in training. You go through these normative off-season type training phases, so that way when you go into your in-season or more focused training, you'll be fine. And this is a very important point that I feel like we don't get hammered home enough. Every session cannot be hard. Every session cannot be difficult. Every session cannot be the most absolute grinder possible. Even with something like the max effort system, max effort method, they use conjugation to kind of allow that. And if you look at everything else they do in the program, while it is pretty bodybuilder based, it's not really all that much, all things considered, because they have a freaking max at the start of the program. So every session cannot be hard. Every session cannot be super intense. Every session cannot be close to your 1 minute max. Every session cannot be going to absolute failure all the time. Okay, so let's get that out the way. Now here's the next thing. I want to talk about RPE and RIR. So RPE and RIR are metrics that are used to try and explain intensity in an objective manner, but they are subjective measurements. So that already kind of questions the viability of these things. What feels like an RPE 9 or what feels like a 1 rep in reserve set might not actually be an actual RPE 9 or 1 rep in reserve. If you look at someone like Steffi Cohen, who her rep speed might make you think that it's an RPE 9 from the start, and then all of a sudden she does like 5, 6, 7 more reps, and you're just like, oh, what the hell? Or even like, let's say if you ever lifted with your girlfriend. I know we don't have girlfriends, but like generally speaking, what you'll notice if you are lucky enough to lift with one, that she might do a rep and you'll think to yourself, oh, that's failure. And then she busts out a couple more. And even that might even apply to yourself. When was the last time you actually tested your ability to perceive your own RPE and RIR? These are things you need to be mindful of to actually have a more, like, the more advanced you get, the better you will be at assessing these things. But it's something worth noting. Like, if you don't actually test out how RPE 9, how RPE 7 feels to you, or RIR, whatever feels to you, do you actually know you're hitting it? The next thing I want to say is that RPE and RIR are not static variables. One thing that I feel is kind of an issue when it comes to things like RPE, RIR, MV, MRV, MAV, MEV, STD, SRI, all these other things, right? Like, we want to keep these things as stable and as constant as possible to make training simple, because I get it. We want to keep things simple. Keep it simple, stupid. That's a very good maxim to live by. But with that being said, that doesn't mean we keep things unchanging. That doesn't mean we keep things static. It doesn't mean we keep things without progression and everything like that. So RPE and RIR are not static. So training, more specifically periodized strength training, must have an ebb and flow of higher and lower intensities. Every session cannot be hard, but also every session cannot be easy, and every session cannot be somewhere in the middle. So there needs to be, even with someone who is more hypertrophy focused, and where there's a bit more freedom and less periodization involved, even then, I'll show you that there's times where it's just not going to be, where there's going to be element of difficulty that's changing from week to week, month to month, or something like that. So always being at a certain RPE and RIR is a bad idea. You need to do hard training. Easier training builds up your ability to do hard training and helps you flush out fatigue after a harder phase of training while still pushing progress. So you can't be training easy all the time, but you can't also be training hard all the time. You need to be able to keep things in a way, you need to structure things in a way where it is simple, but keeps these, let's see, not rules, or more like recommendations just in mind, right? So let's look at, where's my mouse? So let's look at daily undulation, right? So daily undulation, so when I'm talking about intensity, like moving up and down, ebbing and flowing, there's really 3 different kinds. I could be a bit more big brain about it and use a bit more of a standardized scientific gigabrain term, but we're not going to do that. So when I say daily, you could make that to mean like microcycle, like within the microcycle, within the week. So let's say on Monday, you do a 5x5, and then on Thursday, you do a 3x10 at the lower threshold, or maybe another 5x5, but at 20% lighter. That's undulating your intensity. So if you train a movement more frequently, it may benefit you to undulate your training. It's not always necessary. One example of this that I can think of off the top of my head was Faz Lift Tactician program, where you're basically doing a heavy, light, heavy setup. It can be modified to be heavy, light, medium, but it's a heavy day, you're pushing progression, you rest, then you have a light day, then you rest again, then you have your heavy day again. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you're pushing progression. So that's one example. Daily undulation is used when you train a muscle or lift more frequently, but that does not mean it is always or should always be used, with example being the Tactician program by Faz. So this really just happens if you do, like, let's say you bench twice a week, you squat twice a week, you do some type of hinge variation twice a week. Generally speaking, it's going to benefit you to work it in different thresholds because they have different recovery demands. When you are closer or higher in the intensity, your nervous system will take a bigger hit. But otherwise, when it just becomes like you doing a more, a better stimulus to fatigue ratio movement, a better movement that you can recover from. Like, it's much easier to recover from a hamstring curl than it is a Romanian deadlift. It's much easier to recover from a bicep curl than it is a chin up. So those are kind of examples there. But the idea is that if you do a certain movement, if you do a certain lift, if you do a certain muscle group, you should consider undulating them between those days, which is why I call it daily undulation. It's not you just doing like changing it every day to change it for changing its sake, right? Then there's weekly. So weekly undulation, this is kind of like what wave loading essentially is. So let's say week 1, you're at 60%, or you're at a 4 RIR if you are reliable in your measurement with that. Then at week 2, you go up to 70%. And then week 3, you go back to 80%. And then you go back to week 1 with slightly more load. So maybe you're now at 62.5% or something like that, right? But the idea is, let's say you're in a phase of training where you're doing like 8s, 5s, 3s, 5, 3, 1, something like that, or just like a top set where you do as many reps as possible or something of that nature. But the idea is you are changing the load, you are changing the intensity week to week. And then when you return to that easier session of that wave, you want to try to push progression on it, even marginally. Even if it's just like I said, 5 pounds, that's still a sign of progress. And then you kind of go from there. So moving on, we got monthly. So this is more of the macro cycle kind of thing, or maybe this one's a bit more meso, but whatever. We're not trying to talk about the big brain stuff right now. Step loading is a good example of this because you're going to be staying with a specific weight for a lot longer. So week 1, you're either going to choose to progress in sets or reps, not both. Choose one, sets or reps. So either you do 3 sets of 8, then 4 sets of 8 next week, and the week after that, 5 sets of 8, and then you do like an 8 rep max, and then that's good. Or you do something like 3 sets of 6, 3 sets of 7, 3 sets of 8, and then an 8 rep max, and then you return to week 1 volume with slightly more load than last time. Here is the issue that I see with a lot of the ways that you guys set this up. When you do week 1, 3 sets of 6, it does not mean that this is the hardest set of 6 you've ever done in your life. You have to remember, you are using the exact same weight for 3 weeks. You're building up a body of volume. You're building up a body of work. You need to make sure that you can handle doing 3 sets of 8 with that weight. Same thing with if you add sets, you need to make sure it's a weight that you can build up and do 5 sets of 8. It really shouldn't feel difficult until week 3, and it shouldn't really feel all that difficult until you get maybe to that 5th set of 8. That's what that means. What it is not is, all right, 3 sets of 6 at a RPE 9 for all 3 sets of 6. Then you're going to do 3 sets of 7. All sets of 7 are at RPE 9, 3 sets of 8. It's not going to work that way. You're going to be at 3 sets of 6. It's going to be like a RPE 7, 6. It's going to be easy. That's how you want to think of it. It's going to be easy because it should be easy. And then week 2. It's probably still going to be easy. It's going to be harder than the session before, giggity, but it's not too hard. That's what she said. So, and then finally week 3, that's where the difficulty finally shows it, for the difficult, and then week 4, you finally push it to its absolute greatest extent, and then you just return to week 1 the next time. Linear periodization is also a good example of this monthly or more macro cycle kind of way of undulating, where let's say for a couple months or a couple weeks, you're in an 8s block, then you're in a 5s block, then you're in a 3s block, and then you kind of go from there and maybe do like doubles, singles, or just return back to 8s. Or if you want to be a bit more high volume with it, 15s, 12s, 10s, or 12s, 9s and 6s, 12s, 8s and 5s. Like there's a bunch of ways to do it. But generally speaking, what you're going to be doing, you're just going to be sticking at a certain threshold. You're going to be linearly progressing within that threshold. And when you can no longer linear progress within that threshold, thus meaning you stall, then you add load and drop the reps. So you are, let's say you're doing 3 sets of 8. You keep adding weight in the 3 sets of 8 rep range, and then when you can no longer do sets of 8, you drop down to 5s, and then you continue adding load. Then when you can no longer do 5s, you drop down to 3s, and you continue adding load. And then you can decide, all right, do I return back to 8s? Or do I deload? Do I unload? Do I do doubles? Do I do singles? And go from there. So that's kind of how intensity will change depending on your structure of training and the way you decide to train. Here are the key concepts though. Volume builds strength. As much as singles, doubles, and triples are just easier, you could argue more specific, I personally don't enjoy super high set training and I don't enjoy high rep training. So I know we don't train solely to enjoy our training. Like we train for certain results, and like I will do whatever I need to do for my results. But at the same time, if I have options and these options are equally viable or they are effective, meaning they just work, I'm going to choose the one that I can stick to with more consistency. So if you are more strength focused, you cannot ignore the fact that you do need to volumize, that you do need to have points in time where you're handling more volume, where you're going closer to failure, where you're building muscle. Those are really important things that you need to be able to do. And then if intensity is kept more stable, and that means progress will be more subtle. It won't be super dramatic. You will add weight maybe once a month, like as you get stronger or whatnot. So size training affords you more freedom because while you do need to have good programming, you don't necessarily need to periodize or phase potentiate. So phase potentiation is this idea that the work you do sets you up for like a different or more difficult kind of work down the line. So I don't know if any of you are runners, but if you want to run a marathon, you don't just run a marathon like every other day. Same way that if you want to build a PR, you don't just do like a 1 rep max every other day. What you do is you start out with a certain pace, a certain amount of mileage per week, and you build that up over time. So that's phase potentiation. Another way you can think about it is courting a woman. If you want to, court a woman properly, you need to like build up your rapport with them. You need to communicate with them. Start out with just talking to them. Then go hang out with them, like maybe in a group setting, so it's not super like intensive and awkward or whatnot. And then you ask if you just hang out by yourselves, go on a date, go get like some coffee or something, get some lunch, and then eventually, like maybe if it all works out and she actually likes you and you have consent, you can hold her hand. That the most inappropriate, the most lewd act in all human history, holding hands. You can finally do it. So there's that, right? That's basically what phase potentiation is. You want to build up to the hard, more important training sessions because you can't just do those hard, most important training sessions all the time. The next thing I want to kind of cover is the idea of effective training. So effective training, the way I kind of talk about it, I don't just mean maximally effective, meaning it's the most optimal, it's the best way to do it, bruh. But RPE, but still, like, you know, like all that kind of weird stuff where people get super hyped up and defensive about like whatever someone said, whether they're super bro sciencey or actual sciencey, like doesn't really matter. Like when I talk about effective training, I just mean, did it fucking work? And can you do it again? Like that's it. Like we don't need to overcomplicate it too far from that. We forget that the bro science guys who are not super bro science, but just, you know, a bit more monkey minded, and the like super hard science guys are all trying to just do one thing: spread information that works. We try, and then the worst thing we can do is hijack that, make it fit our own ideology, and make it so far away from what it is, and where we just try to say, no, we started applying morals to it. You're either right or wrong. No, the most important thing in training is, did it work? Was it effective? And here's the thing: effective training occurs whether you are 1 rep in reserve or 4 reps in reserve, meaning you're going to elicit a hypertrophy or strength response when you are training within that range. Same thing with 9 or 6 RPE. It's not like there's no benefit to it. Even when you're going a bit below that, there's still an effect to it, meaning it's by its very nature effective. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean maximally effective, maximally optimal, but don't get super hung up on that, because then you're going to start this way of thinking which is like, how do I be maximally effective all the time? And then it's just like, what did I tell you? You don't do hard sessions all the time. You don't do easy sessions all the time. And you can't just do mid sessions all the time. It's like I use the mid to talk to you youngins who like to make new words every other month. So there's that, right? The further from failure you are per set, the more sets you can perform. Like, I think that's something I covered in the previous video with come to volume. And another thing that you can do to add intensity to your training is you can add an AMREP on the last set as an easy way to sneak in fairly high intensity volume you can recover from. So rather than just going to failure every single set, if you just add a set to failure on the last one, I find that that's much easier to recover from, but it keeps you able to handle higher volumes while still training for strength. So that's a bit more of a strength recommendation. When it comes to size, like I said, you can be a bit more stable. You can be like, you know, tonnage accumulation and all that kind of stuff, all that goodness, and just go from there. So here are some examples of intensity being manipulated over time. Like I said, we kind of went over a lot of these things like linear periodization, step loading, wave loading. Another system I really like is the rep goal system. So let's say you'd have 3 sets of 25. This is pretty good for like a good rep goal. I'm going to make a video on the rep goal system and why I really like it for hypertrophy, but also like some recommendations. I do highly recommend, I can't recommend it enough, that you do buy Steve Shaw's Massive Iron book. I feel that book has put into words a lot of things that I've just found in my own training over the course of like the years I've been lifting. So a lot of the conclusions that I came to, I did not read his book until very recently, quite honestly. And when I did finally get to read his book, I found that almost all of the points he was making, all the pillars he was making, are things that I just found to be true over time throughout my own training. So I highly recommend buying that book, and I'm going to make some content talking about my modifications or recommendations with the rep goal system. I think a rep goal of 25 reps is very reasonable for most compound lifts, and you do that across 3 sets. So you start out at 60%. You perform as many quality reps as possible, going until form breaks down or you feel like you're going to hit failure on the next rep, and then you add load when necessary. When is it necessary to add load? When you can hit more than 25 reps in 3 sets. So you're taking every set to not to failure, but right before failure. You're maximizing every set, as Steve Shaw would say. And that's what you're doing. So once you hit more than 25 reps, you add load. Here's the kicker. You start light. You're not going to do like 80% and then like maybe you'll get 12 to 15 total reps and then try to add 1 rep like over the next couple weeks. No, you got to start light. You have to build up your ability to do that. Regardless of whatever style of training you decide to do, one key thing remains. You need to start light because you need to actually be able to progress over time. So there's that. Another way of going about things is involving rep range. So week 1, let's say you are doing the 3 sets of 6 to 10 reps, right? Week 1, you do 6, 6, 6. You're in the pocket. You are probably like 3 reps in reserve, maybe 3 to 4 reps in reserve, RPE 7, RPE 6 kind of training, right? Then week 2 comes around. You have one set where you go a bit harder, and that's probably going to be like that RPE 7, RPE 8, and then everything else drops down. RPE 6 again, because you're doing 6s again. And then week 3, the intensity is high again. This is probably your RPE 9 set, but then because of everything else you've been doing, you can handle going to RPE 8, or not RPE 8, but doing 8 reps on the second set and 6 reps on the last set. You're keeping failure far away from you. And then you return to week 1, which is an easier session in comparison to the other sessions in the program. So like I said, the ebb and flow of difficult to easier training, because easier training does facilitate your ability to handle hard training, which is going to give you the best results. And like I said, it's not like you're getting 0 results from the smaller, easier stuff. We want to be super intense all the time, but we can't. And there's no need for it. There's really no need for it. So be mindful of that. I think that is the last slide. So that's it for this video. If there's anything else you would like for me to cover, please leave that in the comment section below. My name is karelstandstrength.com. If you would like to support the channel, I recommend checking me out on Patreon, where you can submit your programs for a program reconstruction if you sign up for even the lowest tier. So what a program reconstruction is, you send me your program, I ask a couple questions about the intention behind the program, and then I'll review it, critique it, and like put my own spin on it and recreate it for you. That's an option there. Other ways that you can support the channel is to buy merch. I do have apparel, so t-shirts and hats and stickers and all that nice stuff. It just really helps out the channel and lets me do this on the side, as well as like help support my family and everything like that. So as much as I would love to do this full time, I have to recognize the situation that I'm in, and I do need to keep this as a side thing for right now. But if you find my information useful, if you want to see me transition into this with more time and availability, your support will allow me to do that. And if that's not the case, and I know things are hard all around right now, and that's totally fine, I will always be making this content for free. I will always be making content to try to help you guys out. So I really do appreciate you guys watching. Like, once again, if you like the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Have a good day.